Winter had settled in deep, wrapping the world in a blanket of silence and frost. You know that quiet kind of cold, don't you? The one that seeps into your bones and makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from the chaos of the city. A cozy cabin nestled deep in a snowy forest, where the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. It's the kind of setting we all dream about when life gets overwhelming. But sometimes what starts as a dream can turn into something else entirely. That's what happened to me, or rather, to someone I know. What began as a simple winter retreat became a chilling memory etched forever in the frost. You might think you'd handle it differently, but let me tell you this story and maybe you'll reconsider. It started with a solo trip, just one person looking for some solitude after a tough year. The protagonist, let's call him Alex, wasn't much of an adventurer, but he needed this. A few days away from the constant noise, the emails, and the nagging responsibilities. The cabin he chose was small, quaint, and perfect for unwinding. A family-owned lodge deep in the wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. Alex arrived just after sunset, the drive taking longer than expected because of the snow-covered roads. As he stepped out of his car, the icy wind bit his face, and his breath came out in clouds that seemed to hang in the air. The trees around the cabin stood like sentinels, their bare branches creaking under the weight of the snow. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The cabin was as cozy as advertised. Wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and the faint smell of cedar that reminded Alex of childhood Christmases. But as he settled in, unpacking his bags and lighting the fire, he couldn't shake a strange feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, just a subtle awareness that he wasn't entirely alone. Something about the silence felt too heavy, too unnatural. Still, he brushed it off as nerves. After all, who wouldn't feel a little on edge in a place this isolated? The first night passed uneventfully, or so Alex thought. He spent the evening reading by the fire, the crackling wood providing a soothing backdrop to the snowstorm raging outside. Sleep came easily, but when he woke up early the next morning, a faint unease lingered like a shadow in his mind. Stepping outside to gather wood for the fireplace, Alex immediately noticed something odd. In the fresh layer of snow that had fallen overnight, there were footprints, clear, deliberate tracks leading from the forest to the cabin's front porch. They weren't his, he hadn't stepped outside since arriving. The prints were strange too narrow and elongated to belong to a person wearing normal winter boots. He knelt to examine them more closely, noting the odd spacing as though whoever, or whatever, had made them wasn't walking naturally. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he followed the trail with his eyes. It didn't lead back into the woods or circle around the property. Instead, it stopped abruptly at the front porch as though whoever made the prints had simply disappeared into thin air. Alex glanced around, the forest seeming darker and denser than it had the night before. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch in the wind. Shaking off his nerves, he told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the storm had distorted the prints, or maybe a passing hiker had wandered too close. Still, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder as he went back inside. As the hours ticked by, Alex found it increasingly difficult to shake the unease creeping over him. The cabin, once a haven of tranquility, now felt stiflingly silent. Every creak of the wooden beams seemed louder, every gust of wind more sinister. He caught himself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something, or someone, staring back. Sitting by the fire that evening, Alex tried to distract himself with his book, but the words blurred together. His thoughts kept returning to the footprints. Why had they stopped at the porch? Where had the person gone? And why hadn't he heard anything during the night? His nerves frayed further when small, unexplained occurrences began happening around the cabin. The front door, which he was sure he had locked, creaked open slightly, letting in a gust of icy air. The mug he had set on the counter earlier in the day inexplicably toppled over, spilling coffee across the wooden surface. Then, just as he began to convince himself it was all in his head, he heard it, a faint whispering sound almost like a breath, coming from the direction of the bedroom. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls. The cabin felt impossibly still, the kind of stillness that made his heartbeat seem deafening. Alex wanted to believe it was the wind or maybe an animal outside brushing against the walls, but deep down he knew it wasn't. Something was out there, or maybe it was already inside. Despite the dread pooling in his chest, Alex couldn't ignore the whispers he thought he heard. His rational mind clung to the hope that there was a simple explanation. Grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, he bundled himself in a thick coat and ventured outside, his boots crunching over the frozen snow. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and unrelenting. His breath formed clouds that dissipated almost as quickly as they appeared, swallowed by the surrounding darkness. The beam of his flashlight cut through the night, revealing endless rows of skeletal trees casting eerie, jagged shadows on the snow. He followed the trail of footprints from earlier, his pulse quickening with each step. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional snap of a branch or the distant rustling of leaves. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, he was plunged into darkness. Just as he tapped the flashlight back to life, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping between the trees. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. The only reply was the echo of his own words. Then, in a small clearing ahead, the beam of his light landed on something chilling, an object half buried in the snow. A tattered scarf, its frayed edges stiff with frost. It wasn't his and it wasn't there earlier. Alex's stomach twisted. Someone, or something, had left it for him to find. Alex's trembling hand reached for the scarf, but something stopped him. A low, guttural sound, a mix of a growl and a wheeze, came from deeper in the forest. He froze, his breath hitching, and slowly tilted the flashlight toward the noise. The beam of light wavered, his unsteady hand unable to hold it steady. The sound grew louder, closer, until he spotted it. Just beyond the trees stood a figure, its outline distorted by the shadows. At first he thought it was human, but as it moved closer, the truth unraveled. It was taller than any person, its gaunt frame wrapped in a tattered cloak that seemed to sway unnaturally, even in the still air. Its face, if it could even be called that, was obscured, but two glowing eyes pierced through the darkness like burning coals. Alex stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his ears. The figure moved without a sound, gliding rather than stepping, closing the distance between them. Panic overtook him as the flashlight slipped from his grip, landing in the snow with a muffled thud. He scrambled to pick it up, his fingers numb from the cold and trembling with fear. When he finally managed to shine the light again, the figure was only feet away. Its cloak parted slightly, revealing long, skeletal hands with sharp, claw-like fingers. It let out another guttural growl and Alex's knees buckled. Desperation surged within him. He turned and ran, the creature's presence looming behind him, its growl echoing in his ears. His lungs burned from the icy air, but he didn't dare look back. Each second stretched into an eternity as the line between survival and whatever awaited him blurred. Alex's legs burned as he pushed through the snow, each step a monumental effort against the frigid terrain. The creature's guttural growl grew louder, closing the gap with an eerie ease. He stumbled, nearly falling, but his instincts screamed at him to keep going. In the chaos of his panic, a glimmer of light caught his eye, a faint glow in the distance. Was the cabin. Summoning every ounce of strength, Alex sprinted toward the safety of the cabin. He threw himself against the door, slamming it shut behind him. His hands fumbled to lock it as a loud thud shook the wooden frame. The creature was just outside, its claws scraping against the walls, leaving deep, jagged marks. Alex grabbed the fire poker from beside the hearth, his chest heaving. His breath fogged in the icy air as he prepared for the inevitable. Another loud crash came as the door buckled, splinters flying into the room. He gripped the poker tightly, adrenaline coursing through him as the creature forced its way inside. Its figure loomed in the doorway, blocking out the moonlight. For a brief moment, the two locked eyes, those burning coals piercing into Alex's soul. It lunged forward, but Alex swung the poker with all his might. The metal struck its skeletal hand, emitting a sharp, bone-chilling screech. Seizing the moment, Alex hurled a nearby lantern at the creature. Flames erupted, the fire catching on its tattered cloak. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning fabric and a deafening howl as the creature writhed, retreating out the door and into the night. Alex slammed the door shut again, bracing it with furniture. He collapsed by the fire, his body trembling. Outside, the sounds of the creature faded, but its presence lingered in the oppressive silence. The cabin was secure, but Alex knew the horror was far from over. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Alex sat by the dying embers of the fire, his body still trembling from the ordeal. His mind raced with unanswered questions. What was that creature? Why had it targeted him? Was it truly gone or simply waiting for another chance? The cabin, once a haven of peace, now felt like a fragile shell against the unknown terrors outside. The walls seemed thinner, the shadows darker, and every creak of the wood sent a shiver down his spine. He replayed the events over and over, searching for some rational explanation, but nothing fit. Morning brought a pale light that barely pierced through the frost-covered windows. Alex cautiously opened the door, stepping into the snow. The deep gouges in the wood and the charred remnants of the creature's path were all the proof he needed that the nightmare had been real. The footprints, however, were gone, obliterated by the wind as if the forest itself wanted to erase any trace of the encounter. As Alex packed his belongings and prepared to leave, a lingering unease settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't finished with him. Glancing back at the cabin one last time, he noticed something he hadn't before: strange symbols etched faintly into the wood above the door frame. They pulsed faintly, almost as if alive. He turned away, heart pounding, and rode his snowmobile down the path, vowing never to return. But as he drove away, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him from the trees, a shadowy presence he couldn't see but could feel in his very soul. Alex knew the terror he had faced wasn't just a fleeting nightmare. It was a reminder of something darker, lurking just beyond the veil of the everyday world, waiting for those unlucky enough to cross its path. The chilling events Alex experienced in that isolated cabin serve as a stark reminder of the mysteries and dangers hidden in the shadows of the world we think we know. What would you have done in his place? Could you face such an unimaginable terror alone, or would the fear drive you to flee before the worst even unfolded? The haunting symbols above the cabin door, the eerie absence of footprints, and the creature's relentless pursuit leave us with lingering questions. Was Alex chosen or simply unlucky? And will the entity remain bound to that cabin, or does it now follow him, its next move shrouded in secrecy? If this story has sent a chill down your spine or made you glance over your shoulder, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the creature was? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable like this? Be sure to like this video, share it with friends who enjoy true horror, and subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that'll keep you up at night. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't just in our imagination. They're real, waiting in the cold, dark corners of the world, just like Alex's frigid phantom. Story 2. The season's first snow blanketed the remote village of Skogsbyn in a thick, undisturbed layer of white, turning it into a picture-perfect winter haven. Nestled deep in the Scandinavian wilderness, the town was a world of its own, far removed from the chaos of modern life. In this frozen retreat, life revolved around hearty meals, crackling fireplaces, and stories shared over steaming mugs of mulled wine. Among the residents was Erik Nystrom, a reclusive woodworker who had lived there his entire life. His days were spent crafting intricate sculptures from pine and birch, and the woods around him provided both inspiration and solitude. But even Erik, with his quiet demeanor and rugged independence, could not ignore the unease that had settled over the village this winter. The snow had arrived earlier than usual, bringing with it a biting cold that seemed unnatural, even for Skogsbyn. Whispers circulated among the villagers of strange occurrences in the forest, unexplained footprints in the snow, distant howls that did not belong to wolves, and shadows moving where no one should have been. Erik had always dismissed such talk as idle superstition, but this year, he found himself pausing at the edge of the woods, his gaze lingering on the dark expanse of trees that seemed to close in like silent watchers on one of Erik's routine trips into the forest, seeking the perfect wood for his next project, that he stumbled upon something that made his breath catch. The morning sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows on the snow-covered ground. The crisp air carried the faint scent of pine and the muffled crunch of his boots as he ventured deeper. Near an old cedar tree, Erik stopped in his tracks. Beneath the undisturbed blanket of snow, a peculiar depression caught his. The imprint was unlike anything he had seen before. A perfect circle, etched with symbols that seemed to twist and shift the longer he stared at them. The snow within the circle appeared untouched by frost, glistening as if it had been frozen mid-thaw. Around it, the forest felt different, too still, too quiet. Even the distant rustle of branches seemed to have vanished, replaced by a palpable weight in the air. Eric crouched, running his gloved hand just above the surface of the symbols. A sudden, bone-deep chill shot through him, and he pulled back as though burned. His heart raced as his gaze darted around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting. Eric straightened, his unease mounting. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. Eric could not shake the sensation that something, or someone, was watching him. As he turned to head back toward the village, every step seemed heavier, his legs fighting against an invisible resistance. His thoughts raced, replaying the bizarre symbols in the snow. What could have created them? They looked neither natural nor the work of any tool he knew. As he tried to rationalize what he had seen, a darker thought whispered in the back of his mind. Perhaps this was not something meant to be explained. The forest, usually a place of solace, now felt alien and oppressive. The skeletal branches overhead formed an intricate lattice, casting fractured shadows across the snow that seemed to stretch and move when he was not looking. The muffled crunch of his boots felt too loud, as if breaking an unspoken rule of silence. Then came the sound, a faint but distinct crack like a branch snapping underfoot. Eric froze, his breath clouding in the icy air. He scanned his surroundings, but the trees stood still, offering no answers. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the softest whisper of snow falling from a branch. Eric's pulse quickened, a primal fear rooting him to the spot. Against his better judgment, Eric turned back toward the clearing. He told himself he needed another look, that he could not simply leave without understanding. But deep down he knew the pull he felt was something more, a compulsion that defied logic. Step by step, he retracted his path, each footfall a gamble against the stillness that had overtaken the forest. As he approached the circle, the air grew colder, so sharp it bit through his thick coat. He knelt once more, this time daring to touch the edge of one symbol. The moment his fingers brushed the snow, a low, almost imperceptible hum filled the air. Eric's head snapped up, his eyes darting toward the trees. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, too fast, too fleeting to be real. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint eerie wail that sent shivers down his spine. Then, as abruptly as it had come, the wind ceased. Eric held his breath, straining to hear anything beyond the deafening thud of his heartbeat. Just as he began to rise, a single snowflake, tinged an unnatural shade of crimson, drifted lazily from the sky, landing in the center of the circle. Eric staggered back, his mind reeling. The forest around him remained as silent as a grave, yet every fiber of his being screamed at him to run. Eric's legs felt like lead, but he could not force himself to leave. The crimson snowflake was impossible, unnatural, and it stirred a deep, primal terror within him. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath catching as he noticed something shifting within the circle. The symbols began to glow faintly, their lines shimmering with an iridescent light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Eric stood frozen, unable to look away as the snow within the circle started to melt, revealing dark soil beneath. But stand there, his very soul was being laid bare. It tilted its head almost curiously before letting. From the center of the circle, a hand, pale, emaciated, and tipped with claws, emerged, clawing at the earth as if trying to pull itself free. Eric stumbled back, his eyes wide, but his legs refused to carry him further. The hand was followed by an arm and then a head crowned with matted black hair and hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through him. The figure let out a guttural hiss as it emerged fully, its skeletal form hunched and unnatural, its flesh clinging to its, yet he remained rooted to the spot. The creature turned its gaze toward him, and Eric felt as if bones like a tattered shroud. Eric's mind screamed at him to run, to do anything, out an ear-splitting shriek that echoed through the forest. That was enough to break his paralysis. Eric turned and ran, the ground beneath him seeming to shift and tremble with every step. Eric's flight was frantic, his breath ragged and visible in the frigid air. The forest seemed alive with movement now, branches reaching out like skeletal arms as he sprinted through the snow. Behind him, the creature pursued, its movements unnatural and jerky yet horrifyingly fast. Eric's lungs burned and his legs screamed for relief, but he could not stop. Not now, not with that thing closing the distance. Ahead, he saw it, the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to the safety of the open fields and the distant lights of Skogspie. Summoning every ounce of strength, he pushed himself harder, the shrieks of the creature growing louder with each passing second. Just as he reached the tree line, the ground beneath him gave way. Eric tumbled into a shallow pit, snow and dirt cascading around him as he struggled to climb out. The creature loomed above, its glowing eyes locking onto him as it prepared to pounce. At that moment, Eric's hand closed around something cold and sharp, a jagged piece of wood broken from a fallen branch. Without thinking, he lunged upward, driving the makeshift weapon into the creature's chest. It let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing violently before collapsing into the pit. Eric scrambled out, watching in disbelief as the creature's form disintegrated into ash, carried away by a sudden gust of wind. The silence that followed was deafening. Eric stood there, trembling, his body and mind teetering on the edge of collapse. He stared at the pit for what felt like an eternity before turning toward the village lights, his steps unsteady but resolute. Even as relief washed over him, he could not shake the sense that the forest had merely let him go, for now. Eric stumbled into the village just as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight painting the snow in soft hues of gold and pink. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. As he reached his workshop, he sank onto the steps, his mind racing to make sense of what had happened. The creature's haunting gaze, the glowing symbols, and the crimson snowflake replayed in his memory like a nightmare on loop. He glanced at his hands, still trembling, and noticed the faint smear of ash from the creature's remains. What was it? Why had it been buried in the forest, waiting for someone, or something, to awaken it? Eric could not shake the feeling that his encounter was only the beginning. The air still felt heavy, the silence of the forest lingering in his ears as if it were a parting warning. Though the village seemed unchanged, Eric now viewed it through a different lens. The dark woods beyond were no longer a sanctuary but a threat, harboring secrets too dangerous to uncover. As he sat there, the distant sound of a crow's caw echoed in the stillness, a grim reminder that the forest was far from done with him, or anyone else. In the quiet village of Skogsbyn, the line between safety and terror had blurred, leaving Eric, and perhaps the entire community, on edge. The forest, once a source of life and inspiration, now loomed as a silent menace, its secrets buried beneath the snow, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon them. What would you have done in Eric's place? Could you have faced the horrors that lay hidden in the depths of winter, or would you have turned and run before the darkness consumed you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if you have ever experienced something you couldn't explain. If you enjoyed this chilling tale of survival and suspense, do not forget to like this post, share it with your fellow horror enthusiasts, and subscribe for more stories that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows. After all, winter's icy grip may be temporary, but the terrors it conceals are eternal. Last story.
I was staying at an old family cabin in Canada. Nothing too big or fancy, just a small, humble lodge that my grandparents built years ago. It wasn't something extravagant, but it had always been a peaceful retreat for us. The place was isolated, located far from the nearest town, and the only way to get there was by snowmobile, especially during winter. I'd planned to stay for 3 nights, hoping for a break from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. As soon as I arrived, I fired up the wood heater, unpacked my bags, and set up in the bedroom. The stillness of the place felt like a breath of fresh air. Time seemed to slow down here, and the calmness of the surroundings helped clear my mind. The day and night passed without much thought, just a serene pace to everything. But even in this tranquility, there was something that didn't quite sit right. It was a subtitle, just a lingering feeling, something off. The morning after I arrived, I decided to step outside and gather some firewood. The cold, crisp air bit at my skin as I opened the front door, and that's when I noticed something that made me pause. There were footprints in the freshly fallen snow, leading right up to the cabin door. I stepped outside, my boots crunching loudly in the silence, and looked around. The tracks were clear, but what struck me as odd was that they led into the woods and didn't seem to go anywhere near the road, which was miles away. I followed the tracks for a while, my curiosity growing with every step. They didn't look like they'd been made by someone coming to visit, they looked too fresh, too deliberate. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever made these prints had to have come during the night. I was alone here, so how could I not have heard anything? The air felt heavier as I stood there, scanning the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of anyone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footprints led deeper into the woods, but I wasn't sure if I should follow them further. I felt isolated out here, no one for miles, just the endless expanse of trees and snow. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. My mind raced, wondering if I was overthinking it or if something or someone was out there. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was just an old family cabin, after all. But the unease wouldn't go away. I decided to go back inside, and as I did, I heard something. A soft, distant sound almost sounded like a whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the woods again, but there was no movement, no sign of life. The strange noise seemed to come from behind me, and I quickly shut the door, locking it behind me. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, as the wind howled outside, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the footprints, the strange noise I had heard, and how isolated I was out here. I needed to understand what was going on, so I decided to investigate further. I grabbed my flashlight and bundled up in my coat, stepping out into the cold night air. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I walked toward the woods, my breath forming visible clouds in the icy air. The shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my eyes, and every sound was amplified in the stillness: an owl's hoot in the distance, the rustling of trees, the creaking of the cabin behind me. I ventured deeper into the woods, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark, but the only thing I could see was the trail of footprints, stretching farther than I expected. My heart raced with every step, the silence weighing heavily on me. I could feel something watching me, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Then, just as I rounded a bend, I thought I saw something moving in the distance, barely visible through the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Was it a person, or was it my mind playing tricks? The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving me with an unsettling feeling I couldn't shake. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was out there. My legs felt heavy, the cold sinking into my bones as I pushed forward, determined to reach the figure I thought I'd seen. The further I walked, the more the world around me felt like it was closing in. The trees seemed to grow denser, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, blocking out the moonlight. The snow crunched loudly beneath my boots, echoing in the eerie quiet. Then, I saw it there, ahead of me, was the same figure I'd glimpsed before, standing still among the trees. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat running down my back. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It was a tall, dark silhouette, cloaked in shadows, just standing there, facing away from me. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response. The figure remained motionless, as though it didn't even hear me. My heart was in my throat now, and my instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, as if sensing my fear, the figure turned slowly, its face hidden in darkness. A chilling gust of wind swept through the trees, and in that moment, I realized it wasn't human at all. The way it moved was unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding, not walking. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. The thing's head tilted slightly, and I could feel its gaze on me, though I couldn't see its eyes. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I turned and ran, not caring if I fell or tripped. I just needed to get away from it. I did not stop running until I reached the cabin, my legs burning, my chest tight from the cold and fear. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My mind raced. What was that thing? It could not be human. I tried to catch my breath, staring out the small window in the front of the cabin, waiting for something, anything, to move. The world outside was still, too still. The snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. The silence was maddening. I thought about going for my phone, but the thought of turning my back to the window, even for a second, felt like the worst decision I could make. I needed to get out, but the snowmobile had been outside for hours, and with the way the thing was out there, I could not risk it. I tried to think, tried to come up with a plan, but my mind kept circling back to the figure in the woods. It had to be a person, right? But why did not it act like one? Was it even real? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a branch snapping outside, just beyond the door. I jumped up, heart pounding in my ears. I reached for the nearest thing I could find, a heavy, wooden chair, and shoved it against the door. But before I could even back away, the door handle turned. Slowly, deliberately. Panic surged through me, but I could not move. The door shuddered under the weight of whatever was on the other side. The door did not break. After what felt like an eternity, the sound on the other side stopped. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement, any sound to tell me what was happening. But there was nothing, only the hum of my own heartbeat and the distant howl of wind against the cabin walls. I did not sleep that night. I could not. I sat in the dark, my back against the wall, clutching a flashlight, my mind replaying everything, the footprints, the figure, the door handle turning. It felt like a bad dream, like something I could wake up from, but the cold reality set in. This was real, and I was alone in the woods with something or someone I could not explain. By morning, the snow had stopped. The world outside looked like nothing had ever happened. The footprints were gone, swallowed by the fresh snowfall, and the woods lay eerily silent. I packed my things quickly, too afraid to stay any longer. But as I left the cabin, my eyes flicked to the trees one last time. There, barely visible in the distance, was a single footprint. Just one. Leading off into the woods, as if waiting for someone to follow. I did not want to follow it. In fact, I told myself to ignore it, to just leave and never come back. But my curiosity, the same thing that had led me to explore in the first place, tugged at me. I took a step toward the lone footprint, my boots crunching the snow beneath me. As I neared the trees, I stopped. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I had a strange, gut-wrenching feeling that I was not alone. The wind seemed to pick up again, swirling the snow in random directions, but still, there was no movement. No person. Just the endless woods and that one, perfect footprint. I turned quickly, heading back to the snowmobile. Every step felt like an eternity, and I could not shake the feeling that something was watching me. My mind raced with questions. Why had the figure disappeared the night before? Why was there only one footprint now? And most importantly, who, or what, had been out there with me in the woods? The ride back to the main road felt longer than I remembered. The snowmobile's engine humming loudly in the cold silence, but the eerie feeling did not fade. Every time I looked behind me, the woods seemed darker, as though they were closing in. By the time I reached the road, I was shaking. I did not care how much trouble it would cause, I was leaving for good. No amount of explanation or reassurance could make me return to that cabin. Whatever had been out there was not something I wanted to understand. I never went back, not even once. But the memory of that figure, the footprints, and the inexplicable silence haunts me to this day. Something in the woods had been watching, waiting. And perhaps, it still is.
Did you like our stories? Please subscribe our channel and like this video. Horror story, mystery, alone night stories upload on our channel.